I think if you're listening to this, you agree with us that corruption is a massive problem for developing and emerging countries, and possibly also for some advanced countries. So let's start by asking ourselves what we understand by corruption. And I think you'll find that different people mean quite different things by corruption. And actually, corruption refers to a vast range of phenomena which all have aspects of corruption in them. The technical definition of corruption, one that is quite widely used, and there are several, the widely used one is that corruption happens when a person in a position of authority, who could be a bureaucrat or a politician, but could also be someone in entrusted authority in the private sector, violates rules, breaks laws or conventions which are widely accepted as legitimate, and does that for some private benefit for themselves and for the associates they are colluding with. So this can include things which are quite small in scale, like bribing a police officer to avoid a parking ticket, to massive international networks of theft which take money from developing countries into Swiss banks and everything in between. Why are we concerned about this corruption? Is because corruption has very damaging effects on society, on development, on welfare, and on the legitimacy of politics and the political system. And I think it's really important to understand that we are describing a range of phenomena which have aspects of this rule-breaking behavior by powerful people, which can have quite different implications in terms of the outcomes for society. Most people, when they think about corruption as a problem, they think of bribes and they think of the money that is wasted in bribing to get things done. Actually, that is just one part of the possible negative impact of corruption. And it's very useful to think of this cost for society in terms of two elements. One is an input element and one is an outcome element. One element is the cost of the resources that goes into organizing the corruption. So when you're baking a loaf of bread, you have inputs. You have to buy the flour, you have to use some gas. Those are costs. Those are inputs. And at the end of it, you get some loaves of bread. That's your output. And with any luck, the value of the output will be more than the value of the inputs, and that's why you're doing it. Now, when you think of corruption, it's exactly the same. People are using up resources to achieve something. These are the corrupt people. They bribe, they spend time organizing things. They might also spend violence in organizing their group. Think of a mafia. A mafia is spending resources organizing itself. Those are all inputs that go into the organization of the corruption. But that's only a small part of the cost of the corruption. Often the real cost of the corruption is the outcome of it, how this group of people who are breaking the rules and doing the corrupt activity change outcomes which benefit them, obviously, but which might harm society. When we're looking at the outcome, we're not looking at the outcome for the people who are doing the corruption. It's always beneficial for them. We're looking at the impact on society. And that impact on society might be much bigger, in a negative sense, than the resources used up. So corruption is a double whammy. There is an input cost, but instead of a nice loaf of bread at the end, you also have a bad outcome at the end. And when you add the two together, you have the full impact of the corruption. This is where it gets really interesting, because different types of corruption can have very different impacts on society, and so people get confused. So start with an example of a very trivial type of corruption, often described as petty corruption. Here, you might have bad rules and regulations in a society which make no sense. So citizens might be bribing bureaucrats to help them to evade these rules and get their passports done or their licenses granted and so on. So there is an input cost, the bribe, but the cost to society might be very little if the rules were of no use anyway. But if the rules were important rules, for example, they were health and safety rules, or there were rules about the quality of medicines, then the impact to society is now no longer just the bribes, but also the massive cost of human health and even life if buildings collapse or the bridge isn't built or something is built which is 3 times more expensive than it should be, then the overall impact of the corruption can be very high. Then move to even more difficult types of corruption, like political corruption. And in developing countries where there isn't enough tax take and there are lots of demands in society, a very common type of political organization is what we call client list politics, where powerful groups in society organize and demand resources from the government, which is often then given to them corruptly to keep some kind of social stability. Now here what is happening is that the input cost is all the cost of organizing these client list groups and so on, but the impact, the full impact, includes all the resource misallocation that is happening, the resources of society going to buy off these gangsters often and groups who are organizing this politics, and so the overall impact might be huge. Finally, you might have the worst kinds of corruption, which is predatory corruption, where warlords organize violence and capture resources. And here the input cost is massive because you actually have the corrupt criminals buying guns and rockets and tanks sometimes. And the impact on society might be massive because you squeeze out all production in your society, no one wants to invest. So you can see that the impact of corruption can range from almost very little to massive. So one of the things you need to keep in mind when you talk about corruption is that you're talking about very different things and the impact can vary across a very big range. The second concept to keep in mind is relevant for thinking about anti-corruption, and there we are thinking about feasibility. And the concept of feasibility means that when people are engaged in corruption, they're obviously benefiting from it. So when we try to change that, they will resist and fight back. The feasibility is a measure of how big is the fight back going to be from those people compared to the coalitions you can build to fight them. And for a feasible anti-corruption strategy, you must have groups who want to end the corruption, who in terms of their power, capabilities and interests are at least as powerful as the groups who are engaged in that corruption. This is where I think it's really important to understand that we have to follow a sequential approach to anti-corruption, because in societies with a lot of corruption, you're not going to be able to get rid of all kinds of corruption because the counter coalitions who are fighting it might not yet exist. And so one of the things that will be running through our discussion is exactly that. It's identifying the right mix of impact and feasibility to organize our anti-corruption around. And what we will be telling you through lots of examples is ways of identifying feasible and high-impact anti-corruption strategies where we identify corruption which has very high negative impacts on society, but which are also feasible to get rid of. Because the worst kind of thing that happens in anti-corruption is that we try to do things and we fail. And in doing that, we not only waste a lot of resources, we also demoralize ourselves. And the history of anti-corruption in developing countries has been one of massive demoralization as people have again and again tried to address this extremely serious problem and failed. I think the time has now come for us to stop failing by understanding the problem better and coming up with better solutions that can be implemented.